some of them, interestingly enough, going vertical. What this means is that you would have trees that would have had to have been standing up for millions of years, while the layers of strata form around the tree. No one really knows how many of these there actually are, buried all over the place underneath the ground. This is believed to be the oldest living tree on Earth. Its name is Methuselah, and its age is believed to be 4,840 years old, give or take, which is interesting because if you're using the Septuagint or the Masoretic texts, and even using Gilgamesh as well as the Sumerian Kings list as a reference point, you're going to come up with a flood date a pinch more than 3000 BC, maybe a few hundred years more. And old Methuselah would have been born just a little bit afterwards. I wasn't there, but I know this, that enormous whales really should not be turning up in deserts, and thousands and thousands and thousands of seashells should not be backpacking through the Himalayas. Trees don't generally stand up for tens or hundreds or millions of years, while layers of sediments build up around them. I'm thinking that maybe real big flood did it. Occasionally I'll hear commentators state that ancient India is tens and tens, sometimes even hundreds of thousands of years old. And I've tried to chase the rabbit trails on what they mean by that. It's not just India. You'll find this pulling dates out of thin blue sky, particularly in media stuff, a lot. I can't find what they're referencing. The empire of India began following the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. You begin to see the rise of the first empire of India, the Mauryan dynasty. Going back even further into the Far East, the rise of the first dynasty of ancient China, the Jia dynasty, its inception at 2000 BC, bringing us full circle to our first empires, which would rise right down here in Mesopotamia, where Babylon would become, and the ancient city of ancient Uruk, where Gilgamesh ruled. Land of the Star, which is rested inside of the Crescent, Babylon and Egypt, the two opening players of occult empires right after the flood, and then dropping down right over here, following alongside the Nile riverbanks, where Egypt would become, where step pyramids and the first attempts at actual pyramids would begin to rise. Under Djoser in the third dynasty of Egypt, about 2600 BC, land of the Eye of Horus, and disk between the horns of the most ancient Hathor, both stretches of land dropping down along the fertile land, the so-called cradle of civilization, where little bitty settlements would begin to take shape, with your first tiny fortified cities like Uruk in roughly 2900 to 3000 BC. Coincidentally, both newly developing locations dropping down from right up here in the same area where the boat that saved all mankind is said to have landed. So those 200 angels covered by Enoch prior to the flood does not represent all of the fallen angels that there are. It represents a small portion of the total number of fallen angels, the ones which made entrance to this place, came in and interbred with human beings. This created all sorts of little uglies and unfriendlies, including the giants. There's also indications in the text that this wasn't necessarily voluntary. What some of your oldest pages and little bitty scribbles on earth, including Enoch, in full detail, are telling you is that before that flood, something unfriendly made entrance to this place and was genetically breeding itself, creating its own offspring, turning mankind into a blood-bathed circus of its own unimaginable and twisted design, spreading like a virus generation after generation after generation for more than 1,000 years, until the flood came along, wiping the slate clean, taking everything back down to zero. But then afterwards, another little bitty door opened, and perhaps what was in the past might slowly creep its way back in for a final show. It's my extremely strong opinion that the bulk of the hundreds of truly strange bones and enormous skulls, unlike man, in this video came after the ancient flood. Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. Genesis 6:4, breeding generations. Look at the scope of the size of this child's head. And then breeding even more generations. The size of the eye sockets are enormous. Moving up this large skull. And then dropping down to breed some more generations. And here's another little baby one. And then breeding even more than that. And look at the eye sockets in comparison to the size of the skull atop that tiny skeleton. Enoch 7:3. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and began to devour mankind. It really is absolutely astounding. It's almost impossible to believe that what you're looking at really is real. This one commonly gets called the Royal Redhead. A special thank you to Brian Forrester, as well as his team in Paracas, Peru, for making the footage, as well as the elongated skulls seen in this video, available. That is one strange head. Enoch continues, and they began to sin against the birds and the beasts and the reptiles and the fish. I have absolutely no idea exactly what that means, but it doesn't sound good. And to devour one another's flesh and drink the very blood. It is curious that whether in a biological or a spiritual sense that is equally as deep if not deeper, than even the mysterious thing that we call consciousness, which seems in a very real way to plug us in to reality at all. There's always something uniquely special about the blood.
It is an interesting verse that we've all heard in Leviticus 17:14. You've heard it a million times.
The life of all flesh is in the blood.
The real word is actually saying the ruach of every sort of flesh is in the blood. It's saying the spirit of the flesh is in its blood, not the life. That is being not a poor translation, but a mistranslation.
It is important to note that after death, the blood is no longer usable. As if it's lost something. Every living organism on this planet is constructed of three-dimensional digital coding, like zip files, pure data, zero junk code in every single strand. Tit for tat, line for line, which opens up click by click by click to become a living biological organism, all of it fitting together like a perfect glove. And deeper inside the genome, the framework of pure biological software and precision operating system, file folders containing actual body plans, digital instructions, coordinating every strand, every cell, every little bitty part, pulling the molecular fabric of every piece together to create a biological masterpiece, literally written, birthed into reality itself from scratch, and seemingly plugged in to neurologically and consciously control every single system of the entire biological masterpiece. It's not just consciousness, the intangible controlling the tangible, which is a paradox. The living blueprint for what you call you is alive in every single drop of your blood. One could quite easily come to believe that there's something a lot larger in scope going on here. It does say in Genesis 1:26 that God himself created mankind in his own image and likeness. It's a powerful statement. When you're dealing with the ancient past, or things which may even boggle the minds of trained physicians, let no detail, no matter how seemingly trite, slip through the fingertips. To truly understand Babylon and the time periods lasting to this modern age, the more recent past from which these skulls likely come, one could easily make an extremely strong case that we are merely infants running loose in very short-term little bodies, biological machines, through which we peer out consciously into this thing that we call the material world, built and constructed right out of thin air by digital coding, light years more sophisticated in each and every single strand than all of the computer software made by man combined, all the way back to the very first computer. What the pages of Enoch are saying, as well as the Hebrew texts and cultures all across this globe, is that something has tried to plug itself in and insert itself into all of that. Enoch is not just talking about a set of very dark fallen beings and producing their own hybrid children. It goes a lot deeper than that. What he's telling you is that these fallen angels, which produced the Nephilim, neither completely angel or completely human, but something in between.
So what he's literally saying is when they die, their souls come out from the race of giants that came from this union, gave way to a brood of evil spirits. And those are the foul spirits of the earth, the demons.
The Nephilim die, they become or get added to the number of demons, beings which later cultures would call the underworld gods, the shadow creatures from all of the ages of history, things and creatures that can possibly bleed through from a realm that might be just as close as the air between your fingertips. Now, it is always eggs and semen that things like this are after, right? Or be summoned. Notice the little baby down there in the image. There's a big part of me that thinks that that thing there might not ultimately want to be friends. Almost like whatever it is, it's close enough it can see you. Enoch used the term the Watchers. But in terms of evil, the deeper, darker, more twisted and macabre, the better. And the higher the place of the carnage.
These aren't fallen angels. If he casts them out, the fallen angels can go to the high places. But these aren't fallen angels. These are demons. These are Raphaim. These are dead Nephilim.
Don't forget that I brought up the high places. Sure is a lot of red way up there in this drawing. The more vicious and brutal, the more bloody yet venomous,
right on the
terrifying,
roundabout, third exit.
The ceremony, as if intoxicating things that dwell in the darkness. One of the most respected names in the field of ufology, his opinion shared by notable others such as J. Allen Hynek, was none other than Dr. Jacques Vallée. Instrumental in Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, commonly stated his belief that the UFO phenomenon was in fact demonic. Human beings are under the control of a strange force that bends them in absurd ways, forcing them to play a role in a bizarre game of deception. It was Aleister Crowley, a self-proclaimed black magician at the top of a great many of the most predominant secret societies, to give the first drawing during the 20th century of one of these large-headed entities, a character that Crowley claimed stepped through into physical reality. This entity would ultimately become what Crowley would describe as a spiritual guide to him after an extensive battery of very intense black magic rituals. You may find some similarities between Crowley's drawing and thousands, if not tens of thousands,
cross the roundabout,
of other
second exit,
drawn by
A1231,
people from
towards
every
Sunderland.
walk of life all around the globe. Crowley is quoted as stating, "Today, they call them angels and
Cross
demons.
the roundabout, second
Tomorrow,
exit.
they'll call them something else." The UFO phenomenon simply does not behave like extraterrestrial visitors. It actually molds itself in order to fit a given culture. John Ankerberg, John D., the head intelligence officer under Queen Elizabeth in the 1500s. He would do the deepest of inner layer occult rituals, popularizing such ideas as the crystal ball, alchemy, and the philosopher's stone. These long hours
Take
of
the exit,
ritual occult on behalf of the Empire of England were done with fellow black magician Edward Kelly. Kelly would ultimately leap to his death from a castle tower window. John D., however, would go on
Follow
to catalog
A1231, Sunderland Highway, towards Sunderland, for 3 miles.
a vast array of entities, which he claimed not only could communicate, but could also physically step right through to the material world itself. Though the public position and statement of the Empire was that D was communicating with angels, D's diary, discovered following his death, told a different story, recording that the entities were becoming more and more evil. Notice the serpents, stating more and more emphatically, these things are lying to me. They're not angels, they're demons. UFO-anons and the demons of past days are probably identical. Dr. Pierre Gurin, in looking at accounts of claimed aliens, all roads seem to lead to the occult. More specifically, either Egyptian or Babylonian. Ephesians 6:12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, the claimed mystery religions themselves, but against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness. Whether you're talking about something that just appears in the skies, spiritual wickedness in high places, which really does beg the question, where is it when you don't see it? One theory which can no longer be taken very seriously is that UFOs are interstellar spaceships with Sir Arthur C. Clarke, or physically step through into this reality. Your ancient texts are taking you at least 10 steps further down the rabbit hole than that. I have yet to meet one person who has come out of the occult that does not have, in some cases, terrifying and extremely tangible and real accounts to give. I also find it particularly interesting when I've gotten to sit down with people who have had life after death experiences, most especially if they were legally dead for any number of minutes and have actual medical records. Hell or ancient shield, whether it be from someone in the occult or someone from an after-death experience, some strikingly eerie similarities. These bland, sort of expressionless, pull-you-in type characters with sort of varying degrees of sinister evilness, described almost like a diminished, alternate version of Earth.
After 800 yards, go right on the roundabout. Third exit, A19, towards Teesside.
As lower or different, or falls right inside of, with things that literally grab
Go right on the roundabout.
and hurt
Third
the
exit.
people into actual pit-like cages, wherein at that point the descriptions of the creatures get even worse. Things much more disturbing and twisted than what may channel in to be portrayed as physical artwork and representations of something through the imaginations and the minds of men. Ephesians 2:2, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world. What fascinates me is when people look up and they describe, and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, like these sky city type of apparatus,
exit,
is a
A19.
spirit who is now at work in the sons of disobedience, sort of hover in a murky or black, dark, scarred horizon. Whether in personal accounts or even in Enoch, you get these hints of things that are in the air and things that are that are moving. But diving below, where the people are quickly snatched and drugged to the side by the
Follow
apparent
A19
welcoming
towards
teams.
Teesside
They'll
for
talk about a
21
lot of
miles.
serpents ranging from enormous creatures to these more or less human-sized things, often with man-like or human-like features, similar to the wisdom serpents or serpent gods found in every single major ancient culture with uncanny similarities. Look at that big old serpent crawling inside of the crescent shaped room between the two Babylonian stars. I do believe you're going to find the serpents like the one these three fine fellows are praying to in nearly every belief and religion on earth. The serpents, no matter what size or shape they're described as, just like any of the other characters within the place, always have this ancient, old one, yet vicious and precise, kind of highly intelligent twist. It's also noteworthy to point out the similarities historically of bones or warped protrusions like horns, is in this recreation of Egyptian artwork. Notice the extra set of horns on top is empty, whereas in this rendering, between the horns, you got this little disc resting on top. An environment described at the core that's beating hard, decrepit almost with this vibe of mechanical madness combined with living dead organism of tentacles and fangs. What some might have been calling the second heaven, the said diminished realm well beneath heaven, and decrepit much more than the earth, littered with sophisticated type things in its skies, where the fallen angel, Lucifer himself, is sent to rule for a short span. Almost like hitting the show code key, the virus side of reality, and cavernous needing a breath, drop of water flames. Probably the most terrifying part of all of it is that the things there wanted you there, in their clutches for some reason. It's a prison that collects things that no one will ever come to help. I'm not going to physically or personally go in to check any of that out. I'm going to take other people's word for it. It was Jesus Christ who described heaven as a place full of many mansions, and likened hell to this actual place here in Enoch, outside of Jerusalem, where the trash was burned. It was giving this analogy to common men, the sheep herders, couched in a way they can understand. As if the human body itself is nothing more than a shell, a vessel, a confining temporal instrument, binding one to a specific location in both time and space. Of those who have tried to describe heaven, though there are so many from every possible age range, background, and culture, Enoch's pre-flood account is extremely precise. People commonly talk about this unusual event called the rapture in the Bible. There are technically 7 of them, by my count. Enoch is the first one on that list, and he is the 7th from Adam. And if that has a meaning, he stumbles for words at least a dozen times in his document, stating to you, I wish I could describe what I'm looking at. And then afterwards, talking about this place as if it doesn't even feel real anymore. Now, to understand these things called Nephilim, or the origins of physical evil, important to recognize the entire scope. But perhaps before taking a critical look at that pre-flood world of Genesis, or the kings with enormous lifespans before the worldwide flood in the Sumerian kings list, or analyzing the pages of Enoch, great-grandfather of Noah, I want you to notice the Greek Titan. Creature is part God, part man in this image, with his arms like a crescent, holding the large disc in the middle. Same as what Gilgamesh claimed he was in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest written epic on the face of the planet Earth. The Titans, the sons of Saturn, or sons of Satan. And this isn't just Babylon or ancient Samaria, the place of the Anunnaki, the biblical sons of Enoch, kings and rulers of ages past, reaching out their hands to summons the deepest regions of darkness in an effort to beckon things that bite the very hand that feeds into this place.
AccuS's goal is to provide high-quality engineering components with the convenience of an online store. Buying components...
Very hand that feeds into this place. The sacrifice of little children deeply seated. Derangement, shedding of innocent blood to Moloch or Baal. Working darkness into a frenzy. Playing the drums louder to drown out the screams. Almost like a virus, reaching out to grab its own desires through an extremely naive host. To mass ritualistic human sacrifice. Notice up here above that the serpent is waiting. It's almost as if the idea is that they're feeding something. That the moment his eyes roll closed, that there's something on the other side waiting for him to come through. Notice how the serpent is used as encapsulation, as if to define ownership. It says something really fascinating in Genesis 3:15, right after the eating of the fruit and the serpent in the garden. It says, I will put enmity between you, the serpent, and the woman. The serpent is coming out from the forehead, the place where the third eye, or the mind's eye, would be placed. The eye of Horus, or the all-seeing eye floating mysteriously above the pyramid of bricks built by men. As a side note, it is curious how strikingly similar the eye of Horus looks in comparison to a human pineal gland inside the brain. And dimensionally peering into this world through the glass darkly. And of course the Inca with the symbol of this little bitty owl sort of peering through. And between your offspring, the seed of the serpent, and her offspring, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now take a good look at these symbols that look like little horns with a circle inside them on top of the head of these two serpents. Here's an enormous version of the same symbol. You're going to find quite a lot of these in ancient Egypt. Perhaps quite often on the head of an Egyptian goddess. And there's the little serpent. But it doesn't always have to be represented like that. For example, this golden cow's head here. See here, even the cow's got a little serpent with the two ears or horns that make sort of a cradle. Stars always representing angels inside of it, with the sun shining light out from behind the ears inside of the cradle. But the sun also sort of looks like it makes an eye-shaped appearance going around around it, or a crescent moon with a star. Now, when you're talking about stars, like this large representation of a Babylonian Ishtar sitting couched inside of its crescent, the stars, when used in ancient texts, are extremely often symbolism for angels, or perhaps even a very particular fallen angel. The answer goes all the way back to the Temple of Hathor, to the mega complex of Dendera. Hathor goes all the way back to King Narmer himself in Dynasty 0. That's King Narmer right there from the Narmer palette found in the Temple of Horus. Notice up here the long crown on the head of the king, and at the top of the palette of the first king of Egypt, the first symbol of the face of Hathor, a literal temple restoring the history all the way back to the inception of ancient Egypt itself, with the symbol of Hathor crowned atop the serpent's heads. The Egyptians believed that the kingship of all Egypt started with one named Osiris, a dead man who would be brought back to life by Isis. Osiris would be infilled and reanimated by the spirit of an underworld god. Notice the wings on the goddess. And then up over here, the little horns with the disc in the center. The flesh of the reanimated Osiris is generally a murky bluish green. This union of a resurrected dead man and a winged creature would give birth to what they called Horus. Notice the disc in this image no longer is encapsulated with horns, but instead is simply wrapped with a serpent. The shape is not two horns. It's the shape of a woman's womb, which is why it's on the head of a fertility goddess. And the solar disk, or sun disk, in the center is just like the star was for the Babylonians. And the sun in their hieroglyphs is owned by the serpent, the symbol for the ruler of the air. Inside the crescent, the birth canal, or the moon, being represented in the feminine, in which the sun symbolically has rested inside of and producing Horus, the new little eye that is peering through and watching. Notice down here the serpent, again with the little disc on its head. In fact, at the entrance to the Temple of Hathor, where this enormous symbol is, there are actually 17 little bitty serpents underneath that humongous symbol. It's like a little identifier. This plus this equals this. It's like a post-it note for the ancient beast. Popped right on top of their heads. Move out of the way, we're making underworld gods here. Alright, they're a bunch of demons. And of course, serpents in every possible spiritual sense. Whatever may have been the exact details of what the Egyptians were trying so dearly to express, the underworld gods are not being displayed as just basic common day-to-day knowledge on their walls, but more than that, the focal point of the entire empire. It was an impressive place. Here's a character from the walls of Egypt, which you may recognize, or perhaps you're more familiar with his updated version. The star in the middle, the two horns of Mendes. This text is from the Egyptians' most treasured document, the Book of the Dead, chapter 175, where Atum would later combine with Atum Ra, herein listed as the High Supreme God, states this: "Then I will be what will remain, just I and Assur, when I will have changed myself back into the old serpent, who knew no man and saw no God." The pain, poverty, and hardship common people seem to follow that star. Cambodia, you have the Naga serpent kings. In Hindu, Vishnu sleeps in the cosmos, Nirvana, with the serpents. Perhaps King Solomon was right. There's nothing new under the sun. Most all ancient cultures, particularly Babylon and ancient Egypt, believed that their gods, which could be physically summoned to manifest, were in the underworld. When you hear Luciferians and occultists throughout every age talking about the ability to summon little spookies, things that most certainly do not have your best interest at heart, your entities, very tangible things. Not only does it hate you, it wishes that it could be you. It's my extremely strong opinion that they are not making that up. This was believed to be a dimension running parallel, side by side with the earth, and equally as real, a place full of hate, anger, bondage, terror, total lack and despair, a place where mankind is herded up and cast to the fangs of a vast array of frightening things. But in the very halls of pentacles of power throughout the ages of earth, men from nearly every age of empire, both great to small, in pursuit of mankind's age-old hang-ups, lust, greed, power, or the really big one that goes all the way back to the serpent in the garden itself. Ye shall become as gods. Softly whispered lies, almost like the whole thing is a test. Trinkets in exchange for everything. Now, if we go back just a pinch before the first step pyramid in Egypt under Djoser, and I hop back over here to the land of Samaria, later Babylon, to the little tiny settlement of Uruk, called by many the oldest city in the world, and by some the rising New York City of the ancient world. It's just outside ancient Uruk, where Nimrod, the first king, the one recorded as having been in defiance to the Lord God, one of the great grandsons of Noah, drawn here, deified in this 4,000-year-old recreation of an artifact and artwork from ancient Nineveh, or in the Sumerian writings, the legend of Enmerkar, the king of Uruk, who actually built the great tower that has come to be known in history as the Tower of Babel. The name meant Gate of the God. You can view the Tower of Babel like one enormous mega invocation ritual. They're recorded as inviting something from the darkness to step up from its lair. Was at that point that they described something sort of human-like, entered. 2 Corinthians 11:14. Even Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. The Sumerians called it the Inky, as seen on this actual inscription. He's making entrance through this little doorway with these lines around it, surrounded by these two characters with heads that look something like this. And the Inky was called the Lord of Earth, the giver of knowledge, or the morning star. Sometimes the word Abzu, or the symbolism, like these little wiggly lines here, gets translated as waters. It's not quite correct. The word Abzu means abyss, which is where the Inky, being summoned here, is coming forth out of. This stretching scape of land right here is believed to be the remains and ruins of the Tower of Babel, the place where in either the Sumerian texts or the biblical texts, the tongues were confused and the people began to fan out, were the ancient ziggurat of Eridu, just 12 kilometers outside of Ur. And of course, the very word Babel today means confusion. If you take all of your pages and hours of history, you're dealing with a tale of two cities, Israel and Babylon, spiritual light, or conversely, spiritual darkness. Everything in this place has a lower level meaning and a higher level meaning. After the Hebrews left Egypt, the land of Osiris Ra, the Eye of Horus, and entered Sinai following the plagues of Egypt and the parting of the Red Sea, the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat between the wings of the two archangels, placing the Ark inside the Holy of Holies at the very center of the temple, where the high priest would go in once a year. He would sprinkle the blood of atonement on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. Speaking of power in the blood,
Understand, Moses wrote this 2,000 years before Yeshua was born, before Jesus was born and crucified. So when you say God's sacred name, when the high priest was sprinkling blood on the Ark of the Covenant and saying God's holy sacred name, sprinkling blood on the Ark, he would be saying Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. And the word picture is behold the hand, behold the nail.
Once a year, in the center of the tabernacle, in the heart, that's the unspeakable name of God, by the way. In the Holy of Holies, while putting the blood on the Ark of the Covenant, the high priest sprinkling the blood once a year would be saying, behold the hand, behold the nail. Surrounded by the encampment of all of the Israelite tribes, God gave some very tedious instructions on the setup of this camp in the wilderness, with the Levite priests dead in the center, in fact itemizing out what the exact population numbers were of each of the tribes that were camping. Sometimes the most curious things are buried right in plain sight. I saved some time for you. This is what exactly that camp would have looked like. Does the shape of that precisely calculated out layout look familiar? This image here is precisely what the shape of the Israelite camp would have looked like. Of course, the Levites and the tabernacle itself were right in the center, the heart, right there. And deeper inside that middle, in the heart of the holiest of holies, where the priest would stand before the mercy seat itself and say the unspeakable name of God, behold the hand, behold the nail. This is more than 1,500 years before Jesus Christ. It was a moving cross out there on the desert floor. That would have been so mesmerizing to have seen looking down with all the little campfires going from the sky at night. Let's see if we can take that a step deeper. Curiously, if you take the names from Adam all the way down to Noah in the book of Genesis, and you look at the root meaning of those names, this is what it reads. Man, appointed mortal sorrow, the blessed God shall come down, teaching, his death shall bring the despairing rest and comfort. You'd have a terrible time convincing me.
After 800 yards, go straight on A19.
In the Genesis text. Nonetheless, let's go deeper than that. Pre-flood, Book of Enoch. He goes further than just fallen angels and hybrid offspring. Enoch is redundantly prophesying the coming of this Son of Man, laying out that at a time in the future, not only will what has been done be undone, but further, that through his name they shall
After
be
200
saved.
yards,
There
go
are
straight
at
on
least
A19.
365
then towards
extremely
Wolverstone.
specific
Go straight
prophecies
on,
of the
then
coming of that child and the sacrifice
After 200
of a
yards,
Savior.
then
The Passover began before the
then
final plague in Egypt, before the Israelite slaves marched out of the largest empire on earth, fulfilling every single rule of a Passover sacrifice, no less. And before the final plague of Egypt, they were to put the blood of the Passover lamb on their doorpost. Curious what meanings can be found in things when you're willing to scratch. One curious detail, the symbol of the Tav during any Canaanite or pre-Canaanite time period would have looked something like this. It is true that the ancient Tav, meaning sign or mark, perhaps covenant, looks something
after
exactly
500 yards, go
like
left
this.
on the roundabout. First
Crucifixion
exit,
would not even become a
A689,
practice
Stockton Road.
until 5 ages of empires later under the Romans. It is interesting that the blood would be saving their firstborn sons. God would be
Go
giving
left
up
on the
his.
roundabout. First
In
exit.
fact, even done on Passover Day, while the kings of earth were throwing babies onto open fire pits and flames, sparing no expense to build the grandest of towers and ziggurats to feed darkness their subjects' lives, to satisfy and appease the unending thirst of their little bitty otherworldly underworld gods. Something tells me that in a minute here, the underworld gods and
Follow
the shadow people
A689,
are
Stockton
going to have a
Road
role
for
to play in all
3.5
this
miles.
before we get to the end.
Put the ball where only I can catch it. With field sense.
Role to play in all this before we get to the end. What greater love could one have than to lay down their life for their friends? Here's the empty tomb where Jesus was for 3 days. that 365 specific prophecies about Jesus Christ by no means includes the fabric of patterns. There are at least 4 times that many for the second coming. The hours when all the old scorecards are tallied up, and there are for the first. Restoration and the entrance and return of the King. But out of all of those prophecies, there's only one other person other than Enoch who used this term, Son of Man. That would have been Daniel, who survived the lion's den, while in the very heart of Babylon, no less. It's astounding how these things work out. It was Daniel who interpreted the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the 5 empires leading to the end, including Nebuchadnezzar's own, and not including the 2 before it. That makes a total of 7. I wonder if that means anything. But an angel would appear in the later years of Daniel's life. More specifically, Gabriel, the same angel that came to Mary prior to the birth of Jesus Christ, as well as believed to be an angel at the tomb after the resurrection. And not only give him a tit for tat, sentence by sentence, line for line walkthrough of coming history, and we know that none of that precision was done after the fact, because the Septuagint, which included Daniel, was put together under Ptolemy during the 3rd century BC, as is seen in Daniel 11, beginning with the kings of the north and the kings of the south, the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires, predicting even the unlikely rise of the little-known underdog, which would later come to be known as the Empire of Rome. Those are some really impressive guesses, but by far the most impressive of the entire bunch is that Daniel would predict the exact day and date that Jesus Christ would enter the front gate of Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, fulfilling Zechariah 9:9, that the people rejoice as the king cometh on the back of a foal donkey. This would be the 10th of Nisan, or more precisely, April 6th, 32 AD, 4 days before the crucifixion. Daniel is giving you the exact starting point. Daniel 9:25 states, "Know and understand this, from the time that the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One, the King, comes." The date that a Persian king gave the decree of Artaxerxes on March 14th, 445 BC, to restore and rebuild Jerusalem after the Persians had defeated Babylon in exactly the way, by exactly the guy, Cyrus, that Isaiah had predicted 200 years in advance. Countdown leading to the precise day, and writing this more than 500 years in advance. It brings new meaning to when Jesus Christ told the Pharisees, "You think that in those scriptures you have eternal life, but it's those very pages that speak of me." Because of the mass reports of healings and blind eyes open on many occasions, the masses had wanted to make him king, but he never allowed them to praise him and declare him out as king until one very particular day that Daniel had given the math for more than 500 years in advance. Arriving at the front gate of Jerusalem, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, told Jesus, "You have to shut these people up. This is heresy." Jesus replied to the Pharisees, "If I were to silence these people, indeed I tell you, even the rocks
After
of
400
this
yards,
place
go right on the
will
roundabout.
cry out."
Third exit,
If you do the math from the decree of Artaxerxes to the triumphant entry, this point here, 69 times 7 times 360, using the identical calendar system of the
Go
ancient
right on the
world,
roundabout.
most
Third
especially
exit.
Babylon, making provision for the 24-day difference between March 14th and April 6th, as well as your 116 days added in for leap years, you're going to come up to exactly 173,880 days. On the money. Daniel's margin of error, more than 500 years beforehand, from that angel's lips, was precisely 0. But if I hop backwards, much before Daniel, before even the young King David, stamped into the pages of history for the highly unusual, miraculous defeat of a six-fingered giant named Goliath. But going back past even David, the one often called a man after God's own heart, beyond the days in the wilderness, then even the time in Egypt, back to our
After
first little
300
starting
yards,
gate
go right on the
cultures,
roundabout.
down
Third
here in
exit,
Egypt, and over
B1277, Red
here in
Road.
Samaria, the place of ancient Uruk, where Gilgamesh, depicted here as statue, ruled.
Go right on the roundabout.
Right here is
Third
the
exit.
land and area of Ur. Now that is a giant holding a lion, right? Where Abraham, the father of all the future children of Israel, was living. Many believe that Abraham could see the base, the Tower of Babel, growing up. And then it begins, a little something like this. Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show unto thee. Abraham would ultimately travel over here to exactly where modern day Jerusalem is. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curseth thee. That's a very big promise. One night he woke up with hot sweats and horrors that the Lord had shown him that his descendants would be slaves in a foreign land for 400 years. But that God himself said that he would judge that nation. And in
After 300
thee
yards, go left on the
shall
roundabout.
all
First exit,
the
Tofts Road
families
East.
of
Then
the earth
turn left.
be blessed. Genesis 12, 1 through 3.
Go left on the roundabout.
What those
First exit.
pages
Then
are
turn
telling
left.
you is that the Hebrews, Israel, was the delivery system for the Savior of all mankind.
Turn left.
Leading full circle to the most well-known passage in the whole masquerade of particles that makes up the planet Earth. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have everlasting and eternal life. And every single possible thing, short of the kitchen sink, tried to stand in the way of that. What those pages...
Wow, quite ages ago, guys. I'll have to stop it here.